Emerita at the University of Saskatchewan. She has returned to Nova Scotia and is currently a special advisor to the Vice President Academic at Cape Breton University on Decolonizing the Academy. She holds a BS degree from the University of Maine at Farmington and graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford universities, and has been honored with 4 honorary degrees from University of Maine Farmington, St. Mary's, Thompson Rivers, and Ottawa. Widely published, she is author of Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit in 2013, and co-authored with J.Y. Henderson on Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, A Global Challenge in 2000. She's edited several collections. The most recent are Visioning Mi'kmaq Humanities, Indigenizing the Academy from 2016, Living Treaties, Narrating Mi'kmaq Treaty Relations from 2016, and the Engaged Scholar Journal for Community Engaged Research, Teaching and Learning on the theme of Indigenous and Trans-Systemic Knowledges. She is a 2019 Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow, an Honorary Officer of the Order of Canada, and an elected Fellow to the Royal Society of Canada. Before turning it over to Dr. Battiste tonight, I also want to acknowledge the land and water that the University of Southern Maine campuses occupy, as well as the ancestral and contemporary peoples indigenous to these places in the Dawnland. Our campus lands were the ancestral fishing, hunting, and agricultural grounds inhabited by the Abenaki and Wabanaki people for thousands of years. We recognize that we are on Indigenous land. In addition to the Abenaki, the broader place we now call Maine is home to the sovereign people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq peoples. We exist on their unceded homelands. We also acknowledge the uncomfortable truths of settler colonialism, among them that the peoples indigenous to this place were often forcibly removed from it. Harm from the physical and cultural genocide of Native people here and throughout the land we now call Maine continues and is felt by members of the Wabanaki Confederacy who live here today, including our own Wabanaki students, staff, and faculty. A couple points of order. We are recording tonight's talk, so it doesn't seem like anybody has their camera on, but just to be aware, if you don't want to show up on the video, to have your camera off. We'll also have time for discussion at the end, and we will be facilitating that. So if you have questions, you can certainly raise your hand using the raise hand function, or you can use the chat function, and we will handle that at the end of Dr. Battiste's formal presentation. So with that, please welcome Dr. Marie Battiste to our event tonight. Thank you very much.
Great, Madawa Loktiok. And thank you so much for inviting me this evening. I'm greatly privileged to be here at your invitation to share with you my own journey through education and some of the highlights of that education that have led me to work toward cognitive justice, decolonization, and indigenization. Let me see if I can get my, there we go. I'd like to begin also by respectfully acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Wabanaki Confederacy and the homelands of the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq peoples of Maine. By the treaties of Casco in 1678, 1703, the Wabanaki Treaty of 1725, that is also one of the treaties that we acknowledge in Canada, is also these treaties ratified in 1726 here at Casco Bay with the Wabanaki in 1727. I'm here in my own territory in Unama'ki, the land of the fog, although it's been a very delightful day with lots of sun. And Unama'ki is one of the 7 districts of the Mi'kmaq Nation, and our Mi'kmaq Nation covers all of the maritime provinces in Canada, as well as we do have our lands also in Aroostook County area, in which we now have status, federal land status, or federal recognition of the peoples that have been on that land. in Mi'kmaq, we often talk about Pascagoula, which is the district that is where people are in the States. And we are in Unama'ki under the treaties of 1726, 1759, 1760, and 1761, all of which are peace and friendship treaties with the settlers here, none of which had been given up in lands, but has been always in terms of friendship and sharing. And so we recognize that these lands are also not just unceded, but also unpurchased lands of our peoples. And eventually I'm hoping that probably not in the days that I'm going to see, that there will be some ongoing justice for recognition of the lands that were taken by those who came. As I begin my talk tonight, I really want to think about the kinds of inspirations and motivators that I've had in my lifetime as I go through thinking about my own family. This is my grandparents, my Thomas Battiste and his first wife was Bridget Stevens, and that's my dad sitting in the boat. And then it was later after passing of his first wife, he married then Maggie McLeod. This is the territory you see on the left-hand side is Bois-le-Duc First Nations, and this is where my family was born, raised, and grew up in this particular territory, moving on the waters of the Bredor Lakes. Now, Don Wedebexi is where I come from, and it was my mother and father, John and Annie Battiste, who at the beginning of this time called centralization in Canada was a time when Mi'kmaq people were removed from their homelands and put onto one of two main reserves in Nova Scotia. And Eskasoni was the land that where the governing agents said to our people that they would provide education, they would provide health services, they would provide a church, and they would provide an income for people if they moved to this particular area. At the time, there was a great deal of consideration for that. Many people did not move. Those who did move, they found that their houses were burned down, and their church and schools were also burned. And there really was very little for them in those particular places to hold on to. My parents did move temporarily, but in the end ended up going to Holton, Maine, actually Linneus, Maine, to work in the potato industry of Maine, much as what they'd always done as Mi'kmaq people had been moving with the seasons to wherever they could find income and way to take care of themselves during the year. And so my parents went there for a short period of time, and it was in that time that also the residential schools were ongoing. And so my parents ended up taking my oldest sister, to the residential school for what they thought was going to be just for the school year. And it ended up being as long as 3 years that before they could go back and get her, because of the poverty that they could not afford to bring her and to enable her to go to school in Maine. So I was raised in Aroostook County, in Holton, Linneus area throughout my growing up years. And it wasn't until after I completed high school that my parents moved on to Boston, and then on from there to back to Nova Scotia. And in that time, I was, living with them. But and as I show you, this slide is of the residential school where my sister went to, and the residential school was a very oppressive place. Lots of punishment. Now we've come to recognize that the punishment, many of the kids who were punished actually died from either the punishment or the food or the research in starvation that they did on Indigenous children in these particular schools. And so today it's an ongoing unfolding story of children who have been never returned home, and they are finding the graves in the hundreds around each of these schools. And it's thought that there might be as many as 30,000 children who did not return home. And from the hundreds of schools that they are now looking at, they will be looking at and finding ways to identify those graves and to either recover them and take them to their homes, or to get memorials that will be situated in those particular places around those protected lands. So in those years that we lived in the Aroostook County area, my family did a lot of their traditional kind of labor. They were my father and mother, were absolutely beautiful basket makers, and they were artists. And my dad, whenever we needed money before any of the holidays, he would go out to the woods and he would cut down some trees and come home with them. And in the meantime, my mother would park with us in the car and tell us stories, and that would keep us entertained until my father returned. And she was an avid storyteller, and over the years, I always remember that her stories were largely about her childhood, largely about her relations and her families and so on. But in the course of those years, I also learned how to make baskets myself. And when I went to University of Maine, where I went to school, I went to University of Maine at Presque for 2 years. And then I graduated from the University of Maine at Farmington with my education degree. But it was in that education degree that I was able to do something that hadn't been done before. And that was that after the first iteration of student teaching, the second half of it, I was allowed to go to the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot reserves in Maine, where I did my student teaching and under the supervision of the nuns who were in the schools on those reserves. But it was in those times that I met, people like Wayne Newell, and who was a very important force in my life after that, because he was the one that recruited me to go to Harvard University, where at that time Ford Foundation was providing these fellowships for Indigenous students around from both Canada and the United States. And we received these fellowships, and as a result of that, I was able to attend Harvard University on that fellowship. And then later, I was able to get a scholarship to attend Stanford University, after which then the federal government began funding me in the third year of my graduate degree at Stanford. And so part of that was I felt that I was very lucky to have had that opportunity to attend some of the best schools in the nation. And from that, I think a lot of my life has been changed by having that education. Part of what I got in terms of my education was an awareness of systemic discrimination that was ongoing. And it was, later on that, I met up with this lovely lady, Erica Irene Diaz, who was part of the working group on Indigenous populations at the United Nations, and called upon me to help her to do some research over the years. And with that relationship, I was able to also go to the United Nations and be part of the working group activity, as well as working on various projects with her, research projects, and including protecting Indigenous knowledge projects. But what she was talking about at the time was displacing systemic discrimination, which was a passion for her, because she was a Greek woman who had lived with the oppression in Greece, and her and her husband, and she was a very formidable woman who was able to take on this large role at the United Nations. She was talking about displacing systemic discrimination that against Indigenous peoples that were created and legitimized by the cognitive frameworks of imperialism and colonialism remains the single most crucial cultural challenge facing humanity. And she said further that meeting this responsibility is not just the problem for the colonized and the oppressed, but rather the defining challenge for all peoples. It is a path to a shared and sustainable future for all peoples. So as part of going back to my dissertation years, part of the work that I did was to understand that there were major discrepancies in terms of outcomes that happened with Indigenous children. And those were not just in terms of Mi'kmaq, because at the beginning of my education, having not known anything about Mi'kmaq people except for what was written in books, which was not very favorable, that basically I knew very little. And it wasn't until I went to university that I actually had the opportunity to utilize my own graduate studies in order to do the study on Mi'kmaq literacies. And it was called an historical investigation of the social and cultural consequences of Mi'kmaq literacy. And what it was actually understanding the multiple ways in which Mi'kmaq people had writing systems of various kinds before they were introduced to Roman script writing, which was manipulated throughout the years that they were learning those. Partly it was because the missionaries were trying to teach Mi'kmaq people how to learn prayers and other Christian doctrines, but they didn't want us to learn about the French or the English, the troubles which were happening in the politics between the French and English. And so they didn't want Mi'kmaq people to understand or to read the Roman script writing and try to hold us to their earlier forms, which was hieroglyphic literacies, and they would tell Mi'kmaq people that they should hold on to those, as these were the ones that held spiritual teachings in them, and the other one was things to which was only Bible type learning in them, and that they should not need to have that. So there was a lot of manipulation around the Mi'kmaq learning, and it was in that dissertation that I began to understand the multiple ways of knowing that Mi'kmaq people had, as well as the knowledge systems that they carried in and through their own languages, through their own literacies, through their own social contexts that connected to land, to their survival in those particular places. I also was to learn about the political motivations around literacies, to understand that literacy and education are not neutral enterprises. Each are driven by political and social constructions of society, and that at the end of the day, as we began to talk about our own contemporary purposes for learning education or learning literacies, that Mi'kmaq people sought self-determination in the decisions around their language use and functions and orthographies. And these were very important foundations of that work that was happening in that dissertation. One of the things that I took as a course at Stanford University was a course from Martin Carnoy, in which it was a education course on cultural imperialism around the world. And I think one of the most important things that I got out of that was how cultural imperialism and oppression were things that were driven by certain groups of people, settlers and so on, and that they really came with this notion of Eurocentrism. And Eurocentrism was a European center characterized by their discourses of themselves being superior, where there was progress, where there was an ongoing hegemony and layers of people having a hierarchy of privilege, and that it was then to become the monopoly over all knowledge systems. And as we look at Eurocentrism traveling from Europe out to the various nations around the world, from Africa to India to the Americas, we note the number of people whose multiple languages were lost and absorbed by English and colonial languages of French. And these then became notions that carried with them the idea that whatever they did in the British Empire was universal and needed to be given to the periphery, and as a result of that, created empire building from the center. It also became what I called then at the time in Martin Carnoy's class, cognitive imperialism, that Eurocentrism was the engine of cognitive imperialism by which whole nations and groups of people have been denied their knowledge systems, their cultural and spiritual identities, and their nation, their land, their wealth confiscated. So Eurocentrism isn't just about a whiteness per se. It's really about an ideology, and the ideology of this of progress coming from a particular place and sent around the world. It's about the ways in which education, as simply education through various forms of disciplinary traditions of knowledges sent around the world, is in part what Eurocentrism carries. And it is that in this very thing of Eurocentrism that we begin to see the blame frames that emerge through the historical discourses of Indigenous people, where Indigenous Eurocentrism rationalized the subjugation of Black Africans and Native Americans using various kinds of blame frames that frames like God created this group of people for us to conquer, or for us to Christianize, for us as our challenge, and so on, and or this is their nature, and this is the why we need to teach them these particular progressive ways, and so on. And it became an ongoing narrative throughout history. And so the colonists originally viewed themselves as complying with these divine forces, creating a variety of overlapping dispositional stereotypes of savages and different types of man to justify the actions that they did, whether it was to remove Blacks from their lands and create slavery in the States, or to try to make Indigenous people into slaves, and when they couldn't, to try to remove them from their lands, kill them, and otherwise remove them to reserves. So what we found in the 18th and 19th century is the concept that is now moved to notions of race, where it becomes a frame to excuse the actions basis on racial superiority and justifying racial inferiority of Indigenous victims and slaves for their suffering. And then you find the eugenics research that was done in terms of filling up heads of skulls of either Indigenous people or Black, and comparing them to the brains of others, and so on. That we find these different layers of activity that keeps this notion going of the inferiority of Indigenous peoples. So what we also have is that, during the time that, that Indigenous people were entering into these particular treaties with the settlers who arrived, sharing of land, sharing of resources, sharing of parts of their food and how to live in those particular places. And so part of that was that, in those treaties, some of those treaties were we will give you partly our education and our survival skills that we know of, and that will help to transform your nations from having to depend simply on the land, but rather in terms of building more of a trade partnership. And that kind of thing led to these residential schools that were set up in Canada, over 100 of them. And in all of those, we find that there was the ongoing treatment of them was built around this Duncan Campbell Scott, who in 1920 wrote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed in the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole object of this bill." And so it was then that bill that took Indigenous children from their homes, from their parents, stripped them away from their traditional ways of knowing, and taking them to schools and mistreating them along the way, as well as to try to strip them of their relationships with each other, putting the girls on one side and their brothers and sisters were never to see each other until they left those schools. So we had over 150,000 Aboriginal children in those schools. And when they came out of those schools, they had lost their knowledges, their skills, their connectedness to the land, to their families, to their language, to their community, to their culture, to their spirituality, to their Indigenous humanity, their sciences, their knowledges. And what we found during those years, and those are the years that I also grew up in, was an ongoing sense of nihilism, meaninglessness, emptiness, incoherence with themselves and their communities. People actually then beginning to move around to the cities and other places, trying to find a way of living, because basically nothing that they had learned in those schools actually helped them to get employed. And they were actually dealing with all the consequences of that, and the multiple layers of incoherence led to layers of violence and abuse, and other kinds of things that are part of the oppression of peoples. So when the TRC the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came about, they were actually taking up the case of the Mohawk students who built a class action suit against Canada for their treatment. And the government of Canada ended the class action suit by a settlement. And in that settlement, they said, we will run a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We will identify students who have been victims of the residential school. We will make reparations to them, and so on. And so that was accepted. And as a result of that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was published in 2015. And in that was the conclusion that the impacts of the residential school system were found to be immediate, ongoing, and that Canadians had been denied a full and proper education as to the nature of Aboriginal societies and the history of relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. They also said that, that basically people did not know what complicities they had, even as they were in schools of education and creating teachers and principals and sending them to these schools where they were the perpetrators of the damage on these particular children. And so we have a great deal of reparation and reconciliation that has to be done in Canada. Now, what we have found over the years is that these cognitive imperialism, the residential school has all defined success as assimilation to the dominant Eurocentric value, norms, and languages. And so often during the years of my, after I finished school and I would go off to present at different conferences, there would be comments about my ability to speak in English. And they would say, you would be a great model for your people. And what they were saying is that, that basically what appeared to be my assimilation to this Eurocentric values and norms was actually a value added, and that I should then be applauded for being able to speak English, and I should come back to my own people to show them how to do this. And so decolonization was something that, began in those early years as I began to think about what does it mean to be having to be assimilated into these norms, and what does it do for all the other people, including my parents, my brothers and sisters, my family, my grandchildren thereafter, in terms of where would they ever learn about First Nations people, where would they learn about their own new civilization, their own new language, their own new society, how would they come to know that? And it was in those moments that I began to develop my own kind of conscientization about who I was, as well as what my role and my purpose should be. As we did not want to have all of our Indigenous educators to be either seen as either deficient or experts in matters of all things First Nation. So this notion of cognitive imperialism has been written up in literature in multiple different kinds of ways, in terms of Freire's banking system, Carnot's cultural imperialism, the mental colonialization or colonialization of the mind, culturalism, cultural racism, epistemic violence, cultural genocide, as well as cognitive assimilation. And so part of the journey that I have been on has been working toward correcting what I've seen as a failed and failing system of education. I look at one and scoop forward a little bit just to take note of a very important historical study that we did in the book Visioning Mi'kmaq Humanities, in which we did a research study through the Social Science Humanity Research Council in Canada called Animating Mi'kmaq Humanities. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to look at the ways in which education curricula had taken up Mi'kmaq people and how they discourse them. So we wanted to look at how Mi'kmaq people were situated in the literature, in the guides, in the novels, in the texts, in the workbooks, in the resources that were given to teachers. And in that, we invited and asked a graduate student by the name of Nancy Peters to do that research for us, and for which we printed up in this document her an abbreviated report, although it is a much longer chapter than of all the chapters because of the nature of the importance of that particular thing. And what it really revealed to us was why is it that Canadians or public know so little about Indigenous people? When we look back at, the Indigenous people, we looked at all of what was available to them. And what we saw were they were available in these stereotypical chunks of literature, stereotypes of them being various kinds of things, which I'll be sharing with you here. But they created an aggressive assimilation policy that was narrated in these particular texts. And these had common discourses and values and beliefs that the state used and wanted the citizens to hold about themselves or their nation building. And it was built around a baggage coming from these colonial Eurocentric values and attitudes that created the narration of demonization, erasure, and exclusion of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in so doing, part of what they also, when we looked at all of the different kinds of forms and texts that were available, we determined that the Mi'kmaq were considered the racialized other, feared, pitied, ridiculed, scorned, admired, saved, romanticized, sexualized, emulated, copied, assimilated, acculturated, feared, and scorned, continuing. So these kinds of things for which these powerful narratives of who Indigenous people were created such fear, created such disgust, and if we look at in this place where I'm located right now, at one time in 1921, when Mi'kmaq people were living on the waterways of the harbor of Sydney, by formulating a narrative of Mi'kmaq people being dirty, they moved them away from the road and up into rocky lands called Member 2 Reserve, and took them away from the roadway, removed them from their land base, removed them from where they could have access to the waterways to their relatives with their canoes and boats at the time. And it was built around this narrative, this dirtiness, while the doctor at the time wrote in the newspaper that Mi'kmaq people were no more dirty than any of the other people in the whole of the Sydney area. But needless to say, the government would take that advice from these people and move them away from their land and take their land, take this good property that is now the harbor of Sydney. So basically what we have seen over time is colonization and racism building around various assumptions that have been held to see that where they believe that and continue to believe that they are having that all of their systems, whether it is the government or education or justice or welfare, all are inherently unfair for a just people and just for all people. And thus this is seen as the equity model. But what we have found is that in all of this, that we see that they are not able to see the underlying systems and structures of privilege and unfair advantages to some because of the shared norms and values and beliefs and color, cultural capacity, and socialized patterning. And so we find that today in the education system, we find that in the university system, and at the same time, we're still struggling with having to help people understand where those injustices continue to still lie, particularly because we're still dealing with the equity, inclusion, diversity models that seem to be necessary because of these underlying systems of and discriminations. Various reports that have been come out, whether it's the missing and murdered Indigenous women, whether it's the children who have been scooped up in the 60s, whether it is people who have been in various kinds of systems, whether it's been jails or children who have been taken into care. All of these continue to demonstrate how that poverty and education and economic gaps continued to belong to various groups of people, and that they are not justified by those earlier blame frames that I talked about. Now, as some of the work that I've done has been both a principal, I've been a principal, an educator, I've been a teacher, I've been working as a director of education in my territory here before I went off to be a professor at the University of Maine or University of Saskatchewan. And it was in that time that I began to work on my writing, to work on developing an awareness of our Mi'kmaq integrity, our Mi'kmaq self-determination, and our linguistic integrity. And it was in that time that I was working with one of my earliest chapters was in this book called Indian Education in Canada, in which I wrote a chapter in volume 1 on my dissertation, and then in volume 2, the challenge about the Mi'kmaq school that I ran in 1984 and through 87. Our Auditor General in Canada continued at the time to demonstrate that Indian and Northern Affairs Canada was creating part of this problem of Indigenous education being not accountable to the gaps, primarily because Indian Affairs didn't know what it was. Funder, education, it was the evaluator, and they just didn't have a good accountability to the First Nation. And so the gaps were growing at the time and continuing to grow each time that they had these particular kinds of work going on with changing education. So in the course of that time, and I would call the 70s and 80s for me, the beginning of the resurgence and the renaissance of Indigenous people around the world, not just in Canada, but around the world, where Indigenous people were beginning to speak out, from the American Indian movement, from women's feminist groups and so on. But also the era of civil rights in the United States was a very significant time for me in my own education. And it helped me to understand a great deal about how we need to move forward, building upon the building blocks of our own, what at the time was called our losses, but we're still in our communities as knowledges and languages, and still the teachings that relied on our parents' knowledge systems. And it also drew upon these notions of human rights and the fundamental notions of human dignity around the world that was building around this resurgence era. And in Canada, decolonization began in 1982, building around those notions of human rights as well as those of self-determination. When in the independence of Canada from the Great Britain, they entered in the Section 35(1), saying that Canada affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights. And it was those Aboriginal and treaty rights that were also protected in another section of 52 that protected it from the Charter of Rights, or Aboriginal and treaty rights are collective rights, whereas charter rights are individual rights. And so these individual rights could not supersede or derogate from the Aboriginal and treaty rights of Section 35. And so it created the constitutional and fiduciary obligations of Canada and the governments to respect these rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and continue to affirm the human rights in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007. which then I have led to this International Decades of the World Indigenous People, the ratification of UN UNDRIP, and in 2021 of this past year, the Canadian government undertook the passing of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act in Canada, which was now going to align policies and laws of governments, both federal and provincial, to the Aboriginal and treaty rights. Similarly, education has been an important element of recovery for us. And as noted in the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples in 1996, that despite the painful experiences Aboriginal people carry with them from the formal education system, they continue to see education as a hope for their future, and they determined to see education fulfill its promise. In 1996, one of the books that I did with, edited, was a book that built on the reclamation of the Indigenous voice and vision through the work of multiple Indigenous authors around the globe who attended this conference that we held in 1996 at the Summer Institute at the University of Saskatchewan. And that work has, that particular book has been a theoretical framework that many Indigenous scholars today have been drawing upon in terms of building their theses and dissertations. We've been working on building the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch in terms of research, and working toward protecting of Indigenous heritage, which then led to the work that my husband and I, James Youngblood Henderson and I did in terms of the book Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, which is really the foundations of how looking at the ways in which Eurocentric protections of copyright, of trademarks and patents are largely Eurocentric frameworks that are built around individuals' protection of their own rights and or of corporations, but they don't yield to collective rights of Indigenous people. So decolonization is something that, you know, has been, I would say, my jam, but it's also the jam of many of some of my best friends, and also people who I deeply admire in the work of Linda Smith, a Maori educator, who have wrote the book Decolonizing Methodologies, Indigenous Peoples and Research, and in which she talked about decolonization is about centering our concerns, worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. And that particular theme has been the ways in which I have been building blocks toward how people can understand what decolonization actually means, because it's something that people say, well, what does that mean in terms of indigenization, reconciliation? How are they different? Well, decolonization I see as a two-pronged process, and whether you look at it as education or health or laws or everything. Deconstructing of the dismantling of colonialism and the ideologies of superiority and deficiency in education. Now, sometimes that deconstruction is as close to anti-racist theory, anti-racist work, anti-colonialism, and there are many wonderful authors who are helping us to understand what do we need to do to actually dismantle colonialism, because if it isn't, it's sort of like wars. We teach our children about the wars of the past so they can understand why we need to do something different in order that we not have wars in the future. So in the same way, we need to understand what oppression is. We need to understand how oppression works and what are the key ideologies that formulate around notions of privilege and notions of oppression, and how narratives and discourses are used to create those kinds of imagery and other kinds of things. And it is in that we need to really dismantle it. But as you do that, what are you going to have instead? Well, part of it is then a notion of reconstruction. We need to rebuild. And part of the rebuilding is building on the strengths of the community's knowledges and transforming institutions that erase this notion that Indigenous people and what they brought and have in their societies, rather than erasing them, is to recover, restore, renew, and regenerate them in the education system, and offering a balanced education of balanced knowledge systems. And it is that kind of thing that can help to repair the damage, as well as help Indigenous people reconstruct, but from their Indigenous knowledge systems. And so what I've been working on in the work that I've been doing, and I see coming to the end of this time, I would like to raise the awareness and the critique of Eurocentric colonial biases and racialized negative discourses, to expose the effects and losses due to intergenerational trauma and cognitive assimilation, examine the laws and policies and histories and treatment and so on, to raise the significance of the intersections of poverty and race and abilities and gender as ways that oppression is maintained, as well as unpack the narratives about Indigenous peoples' treaties and self-determination. It's reconstruction and recovery of indigenization, Indigenous rights, and recognition of Indigenous knowledges. And so it is within that we're working in Canada on these particular building blocks of recovery, and we are seeing it taking root in different places. British Columbia, for example, has already enacted the UNDRIP. Canada now has moved in that direction, and so we will be seeing some new areas that will continue to draw upon the rights of Indigenous people, the rights to their dignity and diversity of their cultures and traditions and histories and aspirations that should be in their education, the right to control, maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage and their traditional knowledges and oral traditions and so on. The rights to maintain, control, and protect and develop the manifestations of their science and technologies and cultures, and the right to their intellectual property and traditional knowledges. Leading me to my concluding is that it is in my book that I'm working on these decolonizing education toward that healing restoration through dialogue, participation, multi-language knowledge is engaged, First Nation peoples and Métis Inuit self-representation, our self-determination based on treaties, rights, and responsibility, and reinvestment in the holistic and sustainable ways of thinking, communicating, and acting together. And I see our knowledge systems as where we have had them cut down, they're still there, and they are coming back in these small and growing ways into which we can see hopefully a more trans-systemic knowledges, where we can have this kind of Indigenous knowledges and as well as Western knowledges taking root and being strong and balanced and options and opportunities for us to continue to develop. I see that, one of the things that one of my leading authors feminist authors I have often taken on reading and sharing her knowledge is Elizabeth Minnick, and she aptly notes that silence is the shield of domination. When we do not hear, see our Indigenous peoples moving forward and women moving forward, we can see that it is Eurocentric domination that is taking hold. And I also will just conclude with Oslam and Sensoy D'Angelo. in the book, Are We All Really Equal, when they write, the most subtle and yet powerful way we resist knowing is simply by being uninterested. With that, I say Walalin and Waliwalin, and thank you, Missy. There we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Battiste. And we would now like to invite folks who are interested in posing questions to Dr. Battiste to do so. You are welcome to use the chat function, and we'll read your question from there. Or if you go under the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, you can raise your hand and feel free to ask your question yourself.
Comments is okay as well. And don't give me any hard ones. I wonder if any of my family is here.
Yeah, Kathleen, why don't you start us off?
Oh, thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really extremely interesting and moving. And before the general audience joined our Zoom, we spoke a little bit about kind of the tension between safe spaces, I would say, maybe, or freedom of thought and speech in academia, and then also advocating for minoritized populations. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts and insights with the whole group about this kind of tension and balance. I don't know if my question is clear, but.
Well, I would say there's a lot of tension and balance, tensions today. I would say that, you know, the whole issue around, you know, we have been trying to build a larger space for voices that have been marginalized and oppressed over the years. Those voices have been of gender diverse women, of disabled students, those who are indigenous, Black, racialized, and so on. And those have been the voices that, you know, have been silenced over those years, and to which we have been trying to build a stronger, wider space for them to take and enter into that space freely in a cultural safe space. That unfortunately has been turned around a lot with a new discourse that has been resistant to the notions of Eurocentrism and critical thinking around the privileging of certain groups of people in our countries. And that to me is the tension that I think you're alluding to, and that I think we are still at a place where we're looking for ways to engage the conversations with all groups of people, but at the same time recognizing that that oppressions are real, and that the people who have been most disadvantaged have not yet had their fair space taken up. And so at the moment, a lot of the educational programming in the universities have been adding more spaces, more safe spaces, more you know, spaces for Indigenous students, or adding more different kinds of things, which in Canada we call access indigenization. In other words, you know, how do we build things where those disadvantaged groups or oppressed groups are able to now access education, access, you know, spaces and so on, and feel that they can partake in those groups without having the continually contested discourses that we found in terms of the ways in which Indigenous people had been discoursed. They would say, well, I know a family that does this and this and this, and therefore we should continue to hold our, our views toward them. And so we are still in that place where education isn't necessarily a safe space for the discussion that will allow us to critically engage the privileging of certain groups of people, settlers over time, and the kinds of discourses that have been used and privileged for certain kinds of purposes. In other words, taking the land or moving Indigenous people off their lands, or taking their lands without purchase, all those kinds of things. And that, those discourses continue to be used in ways that are not very helpful. So we're still finding that that space is not a safe space. So I often say we really need to help faculty members to build their skills themselves in how to build safe spaces for students and for themselves as well. I mean, it's, I think I've had my fair share of being in, even as a professor, in what I felt was not a safe space for me.
All right, we have a question in the chat from Megan Griffin. Do you know of any texts that are accessible to high schoolers about or featuring Indigenous peoples and or voices? There is so little representation in our schools and curriculum.
Well, in Canada, I mean, we do now have we have approved textbooks, and they're becoming much more diverse. And so approved text in the various provinces and territories are things that have been ongoing here. There are some wonderful websites that are now emerging that I think would be very helpful. And I'm sure there are many in the United States that do similar kinds of things. But I was referencing yesterday in one of the meetings a website called Be a Connectar. Now, Be a Connect, but then R, not OR, .com, I think it is, or it might be .ca. I can't remember. I think, Adam, you connected to that yesterday, did you not?
I think so.
Yeah, and so Be a Connectar is an amazingly beautiful website. There's another one that was done by the Four Directions by Jennifer Wemigans, and there, so there's these wonderful, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a website, and they've got a wealth of resources. We have the First Nations Society, what's the name of that? It's the one that Cindy Blackstock has, that has a wealth of resources. So there are many of these, and I probably could pull up and send to you through, yes, Four Directions Teach-ins, yes, thank you, Angela. That is wonderful pieces. There's a Mi'kmaq direction in the Four Directions Teach-ins, and I was working at the time with Jennifer on that. Some of the work that has been done here at Cape Breton University with Stephen Augustine. If you are looking for a Mi'kmaq creation story online, Stephen Augustine, that's a Stephen with a PH, EN, Stephen Augustine, and he does some wonderful online teachings. He's a wonderful orator. And the work also of Albert Marshall on the two-eyed seeing is also a classic here in Canada, that some of the work that they're doing in that regard. And then there's a wonderful pieces of literature. I just bought my grandson a award-winning book on powwows. And I could run and go get it. It's like over there. But anyway, there are some wonderful, wonderful books and materials that are coming out now. Great authors that we now have, Indigenous authors that are, building large swaths of materials that are making themselves available in and through schools. So I'm not sure in the context of Maine that I haven't followed as much the work. I used to work for the Maine Indian Education Council and long ago as one of my first jobs. And so I think that they also would be now a continuing group. In Canada, there's a group right here, Mi'kmaq Ganamanu MK, First Nation Help, FN Help. They love it, they call it FN Help. But anyway, the FN Help is offers the Mi'kmaq Ganamanu, which is a self-determining 13 school communities that have come together and brought the resources together, and now are building one of the best education systems for getting students through school in this territory. The graduation rates are like, past 90% in all of the schools that are with this organization, MK. Whereas across the board, I would say that the graduation rates are, nationally still probably in the 70 percentile and not at 90. Yeah, there you go. Two-eyed seeing, ways of knowing, indeed.
So we have, thank you to folks, Dr. Savage, for putting in Be a Connector. Angela, thanks for doing the link for Four Directions teachings. Dr. Battiste had also mentioned the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I put the PDF in the chat for that. And then this is the link to an adolescent-friendly version of it. It's currently not working to get to the file itself, but there's the link to where you can get the file. So hopefully it works at some point. We have another question that was sent about whether or not you're aware of any particularly impactful land acknowledgement statements for use with young students. Particularly, the concern was about kind of, this is from a pre-service teacher, having written their own, but wanting to know if there's like a golden one out there, or if there's like a good approach to take for how to do it.
Well, actually, my daughter does that work. Interestingly enough, she does workshops with children, with schools, with organizations on how to do land acknowledgements. And I will, her name is Annie Battiste, and she does that in and through the work she does in university. I mean, in Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon. So, is there any gold ones? I kind of like the way in which you acknowledge the water and the land, but also you need to acknowledge, I would say, that the people as contemporary people today are, and not just the ancestral, as in, this is past, but really the people of the present. And I think it is, as many institutions today are attempting to develop certain kinds of ways to say something in their own institution, that is a good thing. But it shouldn't be the only perfunctory kind of way to do it. And so we're asking people to, in encouraging them to build their own commitments, their own awareness to those particular Indigenous people who are who've been displaced in those places, and learn. And by doing a land acknowledgement, that they can actually build a learning about the past, and as well as a commitment to the future. So it's really a kind of a both and relationship that you need to do.
So thank you. We have another question from Christina Catamaris that gets into some of these tensions that exist. And she asks, part of decolonizing requires intimately understanding dominant systems and structures. How would you recommend balancing the need to expose students to colonial ideas in order to deconstruct them, while simultaneously not perpetuating or overemphasizing these norms?
Yes. Well, I would say this is a really important kind of thing that I'm working on now which is another thing that I'm doing, is we're working in doing research on this notion of thinking historically. And if you go to thinkinghistorically.ca, you will find a method that is being developed by a fellow by the name of Peter Saisis, who with others now are talking about 6 different thematics that you can begin to talk about the past in such a way as to create an understanding of the context of a particular event, the historical significance of that event, the way in which an event carries on through time in terms of continuity and change, the way in which it creates an ethical dimension to the contemporary period in the past, and the notion of perspective. In other words, every historical event in our lives, whether anybody thinks it's the historically significant, it could be historically significant to you. When we think about colonialism, there are many different events that we might look at in colonialism, but we also have evidence, and evidence is the other sixth part of that. And in each one of those, it gives us an opportunity to think out, how do we address the past without creating a general narrative of it in such a way as to say, it's sort of like, how do you work through science, a scientific technique about historian. And this thinking historically is such a method. And I invite you to take a look at the work that we're doing. Thinking historically also not only has a website for how it's done and its various parts, but thinking historically also has another research component to it that we're working on. And right now we are going through doing a scan of all the historical texts and methods and various things, including teacher training institutions, to understand how people are teaching teacher candidates as well as students about history. And in that, my portion of my co-applicant part of that is examining the way Indigenous knowledges are taught in teaching history, recognizing that Indigenous knowledges has its own methodologies as well. And thinking historically may or may not be the most appropriate method to use for teaching this. So we're working with this, examining it, talking with elders, working with various Indigenous history teachers to understand the relationship of Indigenous knowledge frameworks and their notions of teaching in using this thing called thinking historically. So I invite you to take a look at that, and because this is something that is a growing movement across Canada, is the thinking historical method for teaching these particular colonial concepts and other kinds of concepts.
Excellent, thank you. Jennifer Chase asks or says, I'm wondering if Dr. Battiste has something to say about research into the social context and consequences of education being done using traditional Indigenous ways of knowing.
Well, I think that has been part of the Renaissance. That has been one of the most amazing, wonderful things that I've seen happen, is that as Indigenous scholars begin to learn about their own teachings, their own languages, their own metaphors, their own ways of thinking through things in a particular kind of way, they're bringing that into their dissertations, both their thesis and their graduate work. And that has just been an explosion of great ideas and great thinking that is ongoing and coming out in books of various kind in both sides of the border and around the world. So I'm really happy to see this explosion take on, that we are beginning to see that Indigenous ways of knowing, building around land-based knowledge, land-based learning, through teaching methods that are formulated by storytelling, by working in and through communities of elders to teach in their particular kind of ways, because those particular kind of ways are things that are going on everywhere. That the way in which people think about themselves in place and through their connections. Even my mother, who always talked about her relatives, was always talking about her relatives, but also about what they were doing at the time and remembering what they did and how they did it and so on. And it was sort of like, how you cite sources, this was her cite sources technique of constantly reminding me about my relatives and what they brought forward and what they carried and how they did it. And so we were always given a way of learning from the past by listening to the stories that came from our elders and our relatives. So I think that we're beginning to see today in education those kinds of ideas being brought into our schools and being legitimated. Some wonder in the prairies, Métis educators. When you get in your contacts, you forget their names. Anyway, flies off. But anyway, some of the work was at St. Francis School in St. Francis School in Saskatoon. And they developed a model, and some of that was taken from the work that we did in the Aboriginal Learning Knowledge Center, which was funded by the Canadian Council on Learning, for which we created these holistic learning models through First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. And they created their own that came from their school, and taking that drew upon the particular teachings that we had done in this holistic learning models. I'd be happy to share with any of you those models if you can't find them online. But they give a sense of how as First Nations and Métis and Inuit, how they understand holistic learning. And those holistic learning is really about different ways and methods and approaches. And both the Métis and the Inuit use a tree as their symbol to create this notion of holism and how everything works in nature, and how sustainability is one of the key foundations for learning of First Nations people. And so those kinds of concepts of sustainability and how important it is for us to take our education that will be given to the seventh generation. In other words, we might learn a whole lot of things in our lifetime, but what would we want to carry to the seventh generation of our children? What do we want to carry from today or yesterday for that generation? And that's the kind of thing that our elders have been advocating for, is to recognize that, while, our societies may change, while, the ways we may survive may change, there are certain kinds of teachings and concepts about the world, about the philosophies of interconnectedness of all things, about the importance of relationship and reciprocity, and respect and reverence, are important foundations for learning. And that would be the kinds of things you want to make sure that your seventh generation holds to. And I think that one of the short-sightedness of contemporary, if we might say, state education or provincial education, is that they think about it in terms of now and in terms of the economy and nation building. And they don't see it as, what do we need as really foundations for us as people living in a society together? What would we need to take to the seventh generation?
So somewhat building off that question, we have a question from Dr. Jeff Bowdry, asking, what are some examples of decolonizing research? What do you see as the place of quantitative and qualitative approaches? And he said, I've been reading a lot about research as ceremony, and I'm not sure what it means.
Well, it goes back to those foundational teachings that belong to Indigenous people. And that, oftentimes research has been where the individual, and I think that's was the problem as I started up my research, that they said, you have to identify a problem and then you have to propose a solution for this problem, or examine that problem in some kind of way, follow a methodology that comes from an established researcher. And at the time, all there was the Eurocentric methods. And when I was going to school, it was largely around the metrics of statistics and so on. That, I graduated, with my doctorate in 1984. I mean, that was like ancient history, right? That was like 100 years ago. But what was being taught at the time was that there was certain kinds of methods, and only those certain kinds of methods which could be utilized. Narratives were, qualitative research was just beginning at that time. There were, the notion of talking about yourself or talking to other people was thought not to be really good research. So, research has gone through its own evolution now, and we've got more narrative research and different kinds of ethnographies and ethno biographies and multiple things that we call research today. But what we have in them is that we basically are drawing upon different theory and different research methodologies that are driven by disciplinary traditions. So disciplines and their particular traditions, whether you're in linguistics, whether you're in history, whether you're in sociology or literature, or whatever those places you are, they are the formulators of research theory and methods. Now, what is decolonizing methodologies then is to recognize that Indigenous peoples have their own knowledge system. It isn't disciplinary. It doesn't break up, their knowledge system around, this pie of, parts to which then they, look at these individual pieces. Rather that in indigenous knowledge traditions, we operate from a holistic framework, the holistic framework in which everything is connected. And so if everything is connected, how do you then separate one thing from it and then say, I've studied this one thing, if you don't study that one thing in terms of its relationships to all things. So decolonizing methodologies operate from indigenous knowledge perspectives, from their teachings, from their ways of knowing, which really draw upon these really fundamental aspects of, again, land-based, that are often founded in terms of noticing the patterns. I mean, where's in science, noticing patterns, investigating, talking with people about these patterns, and so on, is a method, but they're differently taken up in indigenous people's perspectives and ways of doing things. And part of it is in terms of who has access to what knowledge. Some knowledges are held by the people, some people by societies, some people by women, some people by men, some people by ceremonialists, and there are, not all of it is accessible to all people, as opposed to the research thing that says everything is accessible to everyone. You just got to figure out, the right method or the right, theory to go with it. And so there are different kinds of these ideas that come from different concepts that come from their nations. And so decolonization then is going to indigenous people, utilizing their protocols for doing research, utilizing their languages, utilizing the interpretations from within their own constructs, as opposed to those that come from, these different research Eurocentric theorists and otherwise those who create different methodologies. And so research as ceremony is really talking among them. Sean Wilson did his research and did it with working with indigenous people. So he, like Maggie Kovach, who looks at indigenous methodologies in her book in 2010, it's a University of Toronto Press book. Maggie Kovach, Sean Wilson, Linda Smith in Maori in New Zealand are among those whose work is probably most quoted for indigenous methodologies, indigenous ideologies, and so on. And that operate and talk about what kinds of things are different about this research as well as this other one. There's a great thing online. I'll give you a freebie. It was a research paper that was done by Maggie Kovach. You can find it online. Maggie Kovach, and there among the other authors are M.J. Barrett, Montgomery is Maggie's husband, and then Janine Carrier, and let me see, I think there's another fifth one, but they had a Shirk grant, and the title of their paper or this report was called Presence. And it is talking about indigenous presence in the university. And in each of that, they talk about research methods, they talk about research theory, all coming from indigenous methodology and indigenous theory, and they build it around these particular concepts. It's a beautiful read. It's a wonderful piece of research. I think it's really a valuable way of looking and understanding indigenous research and research methodologies, as well as understanding indigenous presence in the university. Because a lot of, as we bring in indigenous scholars into the university, we're increasingly finding that they are having trouble equal to the students who are having trouble navigating Eurocentric institutions, that these indigenous faculty members have been having trouble navigating with Eurocentric institutions in particular kinds of ways that need to be addressed today as we move forward in decolonizing the academy. And that is some of the work I'm doing in terms of trying to get collective agreements to begin to address indigenous presence, to recognize that there are different ways of doing research and service and doing the production and diffusion of their knowledge is differently done in research methods that belong in the community. In other words, if you go into a community and you do your work in a community, you're developing a relationship with that community that doesn't end just because you did your dissertation and or you did your research. You must maintain those relationships with them. And that relationship is one of service, that ongoing, that reciprocity is an ongoing thing. It isn't one which is a one-off and thus, walk away with all the data and, write your book and sell it. But rather it's an ongoing relational kind of thing that you must continue to build that relationship in those communities. So there's many layers to understanding research methodologies in an indigenous context, different from a Eurocentric context. And if you do those and understand then that indigenous faculty members then need a different kind of layout of how they should move through renewal and through tenure and then through promotion.
So switching gears back into pre-service teaching a little bit, we have a couple questions that are focused on advice that you have for non-Indigenous students who are responsible for teaching Indigenous history, for example, or are responsible for teaching US history. So we can look at it specifically through that lens, or maybe broadening it out even to just say, kind of what advice do you have for pre-service teachers to start taking the first steps in decolonizing education in their own classrooms and building towards this trans-systemic view of knowledge?
Well, I think that the first thing I would just say is, I think that one of the things you have to put into your consciousness is that Indigenous peoples and their history is not the only thing that you need to take up when you do, your work with this. And that is that, oftentimes we can take Indigenous people and throw them in history. We can take Indigenous people, throw them in sociology. We can throw, Indigenous people's context into almost any content area, but it's still Eurocentric thinking. We're building blocks around a Eurocentric framework. If we were looking at Indigenous knowledges as different from Eurocentric knowledge traditions, that is, and you begin to understand how the knowledge system is really built around a foundation of people living together in place, in time, over time, around concepts, precepts, and principles that are, again, related to all things, related to not just, each other and communities, and as we are knowing each other around communities, but we have a particular important relationship that comes from our creation stories about our relationship and our responsibilities to animals, to plants, to the air, to the water, to the land, And that relationship is an ontology of being in the world. And that ontology about being in the world means then that our sustainability of the land and our sustainability of water, our sustainability and responsibilities to all of nature is part of what the ontology is. Now, you can't say that. I mean, you might find an environmentalist idea in Western knowledge systems, but that isn't the foundation ideological construct that holds, American society together. So if you see that that is what we're really talking about, is this ontology and worldview and belief systems, but they really are about sustainability and the seventh generation. And if we go with that, we also see that the teachings that our ancestors have is about our developing our own self-awareness, our own self-purpose, that everything in nature has a purpose, as we each have a purpose. And our purpose is about learning. And as our purpose to learn, then our spirit then becomes gravitated to our purpose like a magnet. And that magnet then begins to make me what I am and make someone else to be the concert pianist, the other one being the president of the United States, the other one to be, so on. And all of these things, we need to recognize that each of us has a purpose for being in the world, learning to get that purpose, and continually to gravitate to the things that make us who we are, and actually begin to change and grow into what we need to be. We never know where we were going to be. I would never have imagined in my childhood that I would be where I am today. But my mother saw it. She saw it in me and began to nourish that in me. And as a result of that, I look back at her stories and teachings to me and recognizing that she could see something that I could not and would not and did not until I get, in my later years. So each one of us has a purpose to which we need to grow into and find, and it is through the learning and through extending ourselves through lifelong learning, not just elementary and secondary, but lifelong learning. We then grow into this wonderful, spirit that we hold and that we've been born into. And that's what my book is talking about, nourishing that learning spirit, learning how to grow into that being that you are. And it builds on a spiritual foundation. And that spiritual is not necessarily a spiritual of God, but it is a spiritualness of being connected.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. We had a question. Is the term cognitive imperialism a term that should only be used in relation to Indigenous and Aboriginal struggles in history, or can it be applied more broadly?
Everywhere. Just like Eurocentrism is not just about a British thinking. It is really about an ideological construct in which one thing is then emanating to everywhere as universal, diffused everywhere, and that represents progress, and thus everyone then must thus change as a result of that. But rather to see that, Eurocentrism and Indigenous knowledges are two different kinds of systems that we don't know enough about, because one, erased the other. And so what we're trying to do is find new ways to recognize that different groups of people, around the world, have come into our various countries, bringing knowledges from their places, but they had to give it up in order to live in this particular place. And so I think that that's what I'm talking about when I think about cognitive imperialism. It is the imperialism of one knowledge system that then wipes out all others. And that represents many peoples around the world.
So this will probably be our last question for the night for
Good.
time. And I'm going to invite Connor to chime in if I misrepresent his question at all. But he says, in the work we do here at USM supporting local and regional Indigenous language reclamation and maintenance, one of the biggest obstacles has been still widely unquestioned norms of European and especially Anglophone models of language learning. Do you have any suggestions or observations here from the perspective of access indigenization?
Perspective about how to teach those languages? Is that that's?
Yeah, I think how to challenge, and again, this is from Connor Quinn, so Connor, feel free to chime in. But I think how to challenge Eurocentric or Anglophone models of language learning in the reclamation and maintenance of local Indigenous languages. Yeah,
well, I think I had some problems with that. I mean, I did language work, you know, in a lot of my beginning because I did a degree in bilingual bicultural education, bilingual bidialectical, and it was a lot of it was around models of sing-songy things and you know, sit down, turn on the light kind of thing. And it really didn't get at the teachings that underlie the various the language system. And that's, when you look at, the grammar of a language, you begin to see notions that are different there. When we think about, Indigenous languages, for example, we don't have a gender pronoun. And so if we don't have a gender pronoun, I mean, we know what different genders are, but we don't know them in the language. And so children would often then, mix up the he's and she's kind of thing. And teachers won't know why they do that. And so one of the courses that we were just discussing today was at one time when our students came to the university, writing was very difficult for them because they thought, and they continued to think in Mi'kmaq. And if you think in Mi'kmaq and you write in English, you're going to try to translate into English from the language that you are thinking in. And so they would write sentences like the sentences of what they were hearing from within their own language. And they wouldn't be able to make those transfers. So they did a course that was comparative Mi'kmaq English literacy class. And in there, they would say, in Mi'kmaq, we say this, and this is how we would think about it. And this is how you would write it. If you were thinking that here's this is the written form. How you change that written form into a standard English form would be to say this, where the object is now the subject and so on. And then they would make these transferences. So it really helped then in language learning for these students who were learning in Mi'kmaq, or who were bringing their languages in Mi'kmaq into the classroom and be able to do those kinds of switches, and also see it in their children as how they would write their essays, and then they could help them. So indeed, coming from understanding how people think in a language is really an important kind of foundation. And it isn't just learning English and English only, and these are the appropriate endings for this verb, which is often the way that ESL classes were taking up. Here's the language, here's the form, memorize it, and not ever go to where people were thinking and how they think in that language. thank you for that question. That was great.
Well, thank you so much for all the questions this evening, and thank you for the It Takes a Village approach to sharing all the resources that Dr. Battiste shared with us. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Katapis, to close us out for the evening.
And would you kindly, Adam, would you kindly take and make a copy of all these questions so that I can get them and send them to me, just as a so I can see what kinds of things people are interested in. And
do that.
thank you. All right.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Battiste, for such an informative public talk presentation and conversation. Very stimulating and intriguing for professionals, practitioners, and scholars who have joined this meeting. On behalf of the School of Education and Human Development and the Libra Committee, we really do appreciate, and it's a privilege and honor to have you here. I also wanted to just make sure that I'm informing everybody. I believe that Angela will be sharing the contact hour certification over chat. And there is a brief just evaluation that everybody can complete. It's voluntary, but we'll also be sharing that.
Thank you and good night. Have a great evening.
Thank you
Great
so much
week.
again.
It's a blessing. Yes, indeed. Bye-bye.
I'm copying questions. I know that it saves the chat, but this is actually easier. So
Yeah, I just